on the third voyage of Columbus, on pages 351 through 352, it is reported that, quote, because the sovereigns of Portugal spent and had courage to spend in Guinea for 4 or 5 years, money and people, before they received any benefit, and afterward God gave them advantages in gold. For certainly, if the people of the kingdom of Portugal be counted, and those of them who died in this undertaking of Guinea be enumerated, it would be found that they are more than half of the kingdom. End quote. Third voyage of Columbus, page 351 through 352. The word Guinea became a derogatory term for an Italian in 1896. Guinea is from Guinea Negro, a term used in the 1740s to describe a black person of mixed ancestry. Guinea was applied to the Italians because they were ruled for centuries and educated by the Marabout of El Ghanim. يقول الله سبحانه وتعالى في القرآن الكريم سورة الأنعام أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وربك الغني ذو رحمة, and your Lord is the independent owner of the mercy. In yasha yudhibkum, if he will, he'll extract you. وَيَسْتَخْلِفْ مِنْ بَعْدِكُمْ, and he'll grant succession from after you. مَا يَشَاءُ, whom he wills. كَمَا أَنْشَاكُمْ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّةِ قَوْمٍ آخِرِينَ, like he raised you from the seeds of the Akhirin people. Quran, 6th chapter, ayah 133. And who are the Akhirin people? يقول الله سبحانه وتعالى في سورة الصفات وفدينه بذبح عظيم وتركنا عليه في الآخرين, and we ransomed him, Abraham, with a great sacrifice, and we left it upon him in the later generations. Quran chapter 37, ayah 107 through 108. These later generations of Abraham were purified by Allah as latter-day saints. The immaculate children of Abraham were attacked by order of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid I, whose military advisor was John of Damascus. Al-Akhirin were attacked at the Euphrates River as prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 46 verse 10. Dhibha, for the Lord God of hosts has a sacrifice in the northern region, the river Euphrates. The Portuguese term emerged in the mid-15th century to refer to the lands inhabited by the Guineans, a generic term used by the Portuguese to refer to the black African peoples living south of the Senegal River. The term Guinea is extensively used in the 1453 Chronicle of Gomez, Aenes de Zorara. King John II of Portugal took up the title of Senor de Guinea, Lord of Guinea, from 1483. The Ghana Empire is named after the medieval trading city of Ghana, mentioned by 11th century Muslim geographers, for example, al-Bakri, but it is used distinctively from Genoa by Muslim sources. For example, they would say Ghana in the country of Genoa. Both Ghana and Jannah are city names derived from the name of Allah, Al-Ghani, meaning independent, rich, and self-sufficient. Ghana, meaning garden, as in Ghana bi'idin nakaddum, the ancient Garden of Eden mentioned in the book of Genesis, and Jannah in Arabic, the garden, paradise. 11th century writer Al-Idrisi and the 13th century writer Ibn Sa'id noted that rulers of Ghana in those days trace their descent from the family of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, either through his protector Abi Talib or through his cousin Amirul Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wa sallam. This can be referenced in Al-Idrisi. The Marabut are the royal family of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, elect of Abraham alayhi salam, who ruled from the European territories of Spain and Portugal to the southern regions called West Africa by European colonizers after the transatlantic slave trade. The kingdom is originally called Guinea in the language of black nobility. The Latinized term for Al-Marabut is Al-Moravid. Al-Moravid. In addition, the more ancient reference from the more credible sources, Al-Yaqubi, 872 AD, Al-Mas'udi, 944 AD, Ibn Haqqo, 977 AD, Al-Biruni, 1036 AD, as well as Al-Bakri, 1040 AD, all describe the population and rulers of Ghana as black people.
amuna ko adu kalbe lol la ne kasi nka yara bibe dula akonye poti mangini yo ko be joto ngene be ka ba boyla wala bodo jodo ngene be ka ba boyla ha bodo duma Ayang todo dumayending Kodaloma Kodayodo Elena Kababeda Kodayodo Ay Ayu dabo Koy man dem bola tandang boy bang ala tandang ko jam fambara bage akadala gongun kenkono rimo be kumara sinan be kumara dala be kalang yawma yunadi bunadi ni makani karibini ala lumu kililati wala walu lati ويجاهر ولبادر وهو بكل شيء عليم وهو الله تعالى مو كان اجيكي نكو ko alaman soto faniya dan ko Allah wa kibar alam man soti kudiya ta nyamunya ku kudiya ta nyamu obe balumbala kula da jonyan te mira la baki salo kana bai salita ita man sali atonya billahi jalan sa ta bai la dunya dembo sanu on pending da bombin da boyda dembo
As early as 1503, 1 year after he had been appointed governor of Hispaniola, Nicolas de Ovando asked the Spanish crown to put a complete stop to the introduction of Africans because they fled, joined the Indians, and taught them bad customs. Nevertheless, Africans continued to be shipped and in ever greater numbers, and the Muslims among them caught the colonists' attention. On May 11th, 1526, Spain passed the first item in a series of anti-Muslim legislation. A royal decree, cedula, specifically forbade the introduction of Jollof, Wolof from Senegal, Negroes from the Levant, blacks who had been raised with the Moors, and people from Guinea. Muslim rebels, the Wolof, were the only African population targeted by name. The Spanish settlers had reason to be familiar with them because the Senegalese had just led the first slave revolt by Africans in the Americas in 1522. Wolof revolted on the sugar plantation of Admiral Don Diego Colon, Christopher Columbus's son, in Hispaniola, in the territory of what is today the Dominican Republic. And they went from plantation to plantation, trying to rally other Africans. They killed 12 whites. Wolof had also rebelled in San Juan, Puerto Rico, in Santa Marta, Colombia, and in Panama. It appeared as if they were establishing a trend, and so, 6 years after the first cedula, the crown issued another, which made reference to uprisings having resulted in the deaths of several Christians, and stressed the danger still posed by the Wolof. They were described as arrogant, disobedient, rebellious, and incorrigible. This attitude is consistent with men who, as Muslims, thought themselves free. They could not accept being enslaved by Christians or being forced to convert, their refusal of their new situation translated into disobedience and rebelliousness, and, as noted by the legislators, could not be corrected. The arrogance is equally typical of men who, as Muslims, would think themselves better than infidels and Christians. The Wolof, in addition, were accused of fomenting trouble by preaching insubordination to the other nations, which were more pacific and of good habits. The royal decree also excluded mulattoes, Jews, gente bereberisca, a blanket name for Muslims, and moriscos, or Muslims, often Moors, from Spain, who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism. These last were considered especially dangerous, an indication that they profoundly resented their conversion and were possibly disposed to go to great lengths to return to their former faith. Still another piece of legislation was issued on August 14th, 1543. It stated that Muslim slaves and free Muslims who had recently converted to Catholicism, as well as their children, were prohibited in the colonies because they had occasioned much inconvenience in the past. Unfortunately for the colonists, the situation did not improve. On July 16th, 1550, new instructions were given to the Casa de Contratación that again prohibited blacks from the Levant and Guinea because they were mixed with the Moors, in other words, Muslims. The interdict was not respected, however, and the authorities in the Caribbean islands, as well as in Mexico, Peru, and Chile, continued to protest the introduction of African Muslims. No fewer than 5 pieces of anti-Muslim legislation were issued by the Spanish authorities in the first 50 years of Spain's establishment in the New World. Though the decrees issued prohibitions concerning Jews and mulattoes, only Muslims were targeted repeatedly and with extraordinary vigor. The Spanish crown was worried for 2 reasons. It feared the expansion of Islam in America, and it was confronted with deadly rebellions fomented by Muslim slaves and Maroons. The inconvenience alluded to in the cedula of 1543 was indeed serious. At that time, in the Spanish territories of the Americas and the Caribbean, Indians were still the majority population, even though their numbers had been decimated and they lived in villages not too distant from the plantations and the mines. It was possible for the Africans who fled slavery to find refuge among them in the French West Indies. They had formed Maroon communities under the protection of the Caribs and were particularly destructive. African Maroons, such as the 300 men led by Antonio Mandinga in Panama, raided the plantations, stealing livestock and destroying crops. In addition, to the nagging and dangerous presence of the Maroons, the Spaniards had to face full-blown revolts from Africans allied to the Indians. Such rebellions occurred in Hispaniola, 1522 to 1532, Mexico, 1523, Cuba, 1529, Panama, 1550 to 1582, Venezuela, 1550, Peru, 1560, Ecuador, 1599, Guatemala, 1627, Chile, 1647, Martinique, 1650, and much later, Florida, 1830 to 1840. Repeatedly, the Spanish settlers and officials blamed the Muslims for their pernicious influence on the Indians. Confronted with the perilous situation, the colonists reacted with the ferocity. Very early on, the presence of an African among the Indians was considered a major crime. For having been found in an Indian village in Costa Rica, Pedro Gelofo, a runaway who, being a Wolof, may have been a Muslim, was condemned to death on September 1st, 1540. He was boiled alive. The colonists had a genuine fear that the Muslims would proselytize among the Indians. These concerns may not have been rooted in reality, but they were strong enough to make the Spaniards try to enforce a rigid segregation of Indians and Africans. Islam did not spread, but the Muslims may have made some attempts to reach out. Accusations and condemnations do not indicate that a deed or offense has been committed. But in 1560, the mulatto Luis Solano was condemned to death, and the Moor Lope de la Peña to life in prison for having practiced and spread Islam in Cusco, Peru. The Inquisition was very active in the new colonies and vigilantly condemned to death what it called sorcerers. Many Africans who dealt in the occult were among its victims. There is little doubt that marabouts involved in the making of protective and offensive amulets, as well as in divination, were killed by the church as a result of their activities. Just overtly retaining Islamic beliefs could lead a person before the Inquisition tribunal. Such was the case, for example, of many Wolof enslaved in Portugal during the 16th century, who were denounced for expressing their faith in the superiority of their religion. There is reason to believe that similar cases have happened in the overseas colonies. Disobedience, rebellion, real or potential proselytizing, arrogance, and sorcery. The colonists had to contend with a series of problems that the Muslims posed. An additional one was their use of horses, as horses were unknown to the Indians and the Central Africans. Cavalry gave a decisive advantage to the conquistadores and the slaveholders, patrolmen. But African Muslims had been handling horses for centuries. The Burba Jollof, or King of Jollof, for example, had a cavalry of 8,000 to 10,000 mounted men, according to the Portuguese who visited the region between 1504 and 1506. Some of these cavalrymen were later enslaved in the Americas, having been taken prisoner when the Jollof Empire collapsed. Ironically, it was the colonists who had asked for the recruitment of Muslim horsemen. They needed men who were used to cattle raising and the handling of horses. And the slave dealers found such men in the Wolof, Mandingo, Tukulor, and Fulani areas of Senegambia. The Wolof, who rose up on Diego Colon's plantation in Hispaniola, were used to cavalry warfare, as is indicated by their behavior in front of the Spaniards. They did not panic when the horsemen charged, but opened their ranks, let the horses pass, and regrouped to face the countercharge. By the 1540s, Wolof Maroons had created their own cavalry with stolen horses and harassed the plantations of Hispaniola. The danger posed by these Africans, who went always on horses and proved to be skilled and audacious both in charge and in use of the lance, was stressed in a letter to the Spanish king written on June 28th, 1546. The Wolof horsemen of the Spanish possessions impressed some of their white contemporaries, and Spanish poet Juan de Castellanos, 1522 to 1607, who resided in Puerto Rico, saluted their dexterity. De estos son los guilosos, muy guerreros, con vana presunción de caballeros. The Wolof are skillful and very warlike, with vain presumptions to be knights. It goes without saying that not all runaways and rebels were Muslims, but the fact that between the 16th and 18th century, the Muslims were the only ones targeted with specific legislation, which attempted to prohibit their introduction, indicates that they must have been numerous and influential in the ranks of rebels. That uprisings were trademarks of the Muslims is not surprising. They were used to fighting for their faith, and they were without a doubt indignant at being made slaves of Christians. The policy of forced conversion that the Catholics launched could only have added to their resentment and hatred toward their enslavers. La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. Warriors of the faith were not disposed to reject a religion for which they had fought, nor to accept their total subjugation by men they probably felt were morally inferior. As a minority, they understood they would not be able to defeat the slaveholders by themselves, that they had to find allies in the non-Muslim Africans and Indians. They had to persuade others to join their ranks. Hence, the accusations made by the Spanish colonists that the Muslims taught the more pacific nations bad customs. Another indication of the fear that Islam and the rebellious Muslims inspired in the Spaniards, as well as of the diversity of measures taken to control them, can be found in the Moros y Cristianos. This was a special type of anti-Muslim play that the colonists imported from Spain and Portugal. The settlers made the slaves in the Americas play out the struggle between the Moors and the Christians in Spain, which ended with the eviction of the former. The story was a good illustration to the bondmen of the superiority of the Christians over the Muslims. If the Moors, who had conquered parts of the Iberian Peninsula and dominated the Spaniards and Portuguese for 7 centuries, finally had been subjugated, then it should have become evident to Muslim slaves that they could not hope to accomplish much in the Americas with their violent opposition to their Christian masters. If the Spanish colonists were suspicious of and negatively disposed toward the Muslims for historical reasons, the French, for whom Islam and its followers were only a faint memory, they had defeated the invading Arabs on French soil in 732, had no qualms about introducing therein into their new territories. The records of the Jesuits and other missionaries show that the French were well aware that Senegambian Muslims were living among them. They even acknowledged the presence of marabouts, as Father Jean Mongan, stationed on the island of St. Christopher, did in a letter in May 1682. There are even some who have marabouts among them, which is what Mohammedan priests are called. A century later, Colonel Malenfant reported from Saint-Domingue that Mohammedan blacks and even dervishes, Sufis involved in mystical practices and rituals, were living on the island. The French missionaries denounced the reluctance of the Muslims to embrace Catholicism, but they did not seem to have any other complaints. The Muslim factor in the Haitian Revolution.
Of Puerto Ricans with Afro-Cuban artists was extremely important for the future of Latin music in New York. By 1954, Puerto Rican was the largest community in Spanish Harlem, based on the economic connection of America with Puerto Rico, offering multi-talented musicians and singers. One of them, Ismael Rivera, o Maelo.
¿Por qué lo mató? Diga usted la razón. Y sabe la respuesta que le dio el matón. Yo lo maté por ser tan bembón. El guardia escondió la bemba y le dijo: ay, yo para matar al bembón, huye, huye, que huye Juanzón. Mira que por allá viene Panchón, yo te juro por Dios que viene tumbando bemba. Ay, yo se la tumba el negrito bembón, bembón por el negrito bembón, bembón por el negrito bembón. Huye, huye, que huye Juanzón.
¿Dónde va? A bailar. Vamos, muchacha, hazlo bailar. Ahora fue la